Around day 8 of a 12-day fast, something shifts. The mental noise that normally fills the space, the planning, the self-narrating, the low-level performance of being yourself, suddenly goes quiet. And what's left is harder to look at. I didn't expect that. I expected hunger, discomfort, maybe some clarity. But what I got was the confrontation with material I'd been successfully avoiding for years. And it came dressed up as self-awareness. And that experience is what I want to talk about today. Not about my fast itself, but what it revealed about the difference between thinking about your shadow and actually meeting it. Shadow work has become one of the most searched terms in the wellness space. There are thousands of journaling prompts, Instagram reels, and 5-step guides promising to help you do your shadow work. Let me be precise about something before we go any further. Most of what is being sold under that name is not shadow work. At least not in the sense that Carl Jung meant it. It is the aesthetic of shadow work. And there is a meaningful difference. I, for example, have been working with Jung's framework personally for 25 years, not as an academic, but as a personal practice that has helped me, that has also sometimes surprised me, and that has changed what I thought I knew about myself. And I've also spent 3 years mentoring professionals, mostly in their 40s and 50s, and mostly in technology roles and corporate environments. And I've seen the same pattern repeating itself. That someone arrives having done shadow work for months, sometimes even years, and yet the same projections are running. The same resentments are intact, the same unlived life is accumulating pressure. The journaling practice in those cases has become a way of managing the encounter rather than having it. And that's the problem I want to address in this video. And I want to be very transparent about something, because it's relevant to why you're here. So if you search Jung or shadow work on YouTube right now, a significant portion of what comes up is AI generated. They're faceless channels combining popular search terms. These channels are producing videos several times a day with no lived relationship to the material whatsoever. And the Carl Jung subreddit, for example, has been flagging that since 2025. There's a noticeable uptick, and people who actually know this work are frustrated by it. So I'm not making this video to rank higher or to get some likes. I'm trying to provide something valuable. And I'm making it because I've spent 25 years inside this framework personally, and specifically in the last years when I'm watching what happens when professionals in their 40s and 50s finally stop managing their shadow and start meeting it. Because that's the game changer. The difference between someone who has processed this intellectually and someone who has been really disoriented by it is audible. And you will either feel that in the next 15 minutes or you won't. And that's fine either way. Now let's uncover what Carl Jung actually meant by the shadow, why midlife is when it tends to force its way through, and what the 4 stages of real integration actually look like. Not as a checklist, but as a process you can recognize when you're in it. So let's first get the definition right, because the wellness version gets this wrong in a way that matters. Jung did not define the shadow as the bad parts of you. That's a big simplification, and it's fundamentally incomplete. The shadow is actually much more than that. It's the unconscious totality of what has been repressed, denied, or simply left undeveloped. So it's everything that didn't fit the version of yourself you built in order to function. And this includes positive and negative parts. And some of this material is actually dark. It includes the rage that you learned that wasn't acceptable, the envy you were ashamed of, or the cruelty you're capable of under pressure. But some of it is also not dark at all. And that's what Jung called the golden shadow. These are the positive qualities you've projected outward because you couldn't own them in yourself. And in the professionals I work with, this is something that shows up constantly. And this can be, for example, your alter ego that consistently admires someone else's courage, someone else's creative risk-taking, or someone else's willingness to walk away from a career that no longer fits, and that cannot locate the same capacity in themselves. And such admiration is not a neutral appreciation. It's what Jung calls projection. Because the quality they're seeing in the other person lives in them too. But it's unowned, it's undeveloped, and it's waiting to be released. So the golden shadow is in many ways the more urgent material for midlife professionals. Because the first half of life is largely spent building a persona. And this is our ego, the mask that we're wearing. And that's a professional identity that works, that earns respect, and that functions in the society we're living in. And the shadow accumulates all the rest, everything that didn't make the cut. But by midlife, that accumulation has weight. It starts suddenly to push back. And Jung was very specific about this. He divided the life really in two phases. And he said the first half of life is for building the persona. And that's okay. We need the social mask, we need the professional identity, and we need a version of ourselves that navigates through our world. But the second half of life demands something different. It's a continuation of the development. It demands that the persona be questioned and loosened, and eventually being dissolved enough to let what's underneath come through. And that process is what Jung called individuation. And that means becoming more fully yourself, your true self. And that requires integrating what you have excluded. And for some people this is coming soon, and for some it's coming later. But somewhere in midlife, the pressure becomes hard to ignore. And the career that made sense at 30 starts to feel like a custom. The resentments that were manageable start surfacing in places you didn't expect. The unlived life, the path not taken, the version of yourself you set aside. It starts making noise. But we shouldn't see this as a crisis in a pathological sense. Because it's our psyche doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The question is whether you meet it with a framework or whether you just try to manage the symptoms. If you want to start your process of individuation, it starts always integrating your shadow. And Jung actually described 4 stages of shadow integration. And I will explain them here now, but what follows is not something like a linear checklist. These stages describe a process, and it can loop and it can stall, and sometimes it reverses itself. But these 4 stages will give you a map for where you actually are. Let's start with the first stage, the phase of recognition. The main point here is that the shadow almost never announces itself directly. It shows up in what you reacted to in other people. And we talked already about this, it's called projection. And Jung's formulation here is precise. The things or the behaviors that irritate you most in other people, or also what fascinates you, and also the things that you're judging the most with unusual heat, that is in many cases an indication to your unowned material looking back at you. For example, the colleague whose self-promotion makes you quietly furious. Or the person in your industry or in your company who took the risk you didn't take and whose success you can't quite celebrate cleanly. Or maybe it's a friend who seems to live without the constraints you have accepted as permanent. But don't judge these reactions. These reactions are data. And they are not a proof for the other person's flaw, but they are a signal about what lives in you that hasn't been acknowledged. So if you're in the phase of recognition, it means simply the willingness to ask, what if this reaction is about me? What if it's not about the other person? And that might sound easy now, but that question is harder than it sounds. Because your ego's first move is always to confirm that the irritation is justified. That brings us to stage 2, acknowledgement. Recognition is noticing the projection. Acknowledgement means you start to own it. You're saying to yourself, internally and honestly, that quality or that flaw I see in them lives in me too. And this is now where actually the real resistance begins. Because your ego does not give up its self-image easily. And acknowledging that the rage you see in someone else is also yours, that the cowardice you judge in a colleague is something you recognize in yourself, that the envy you feel towards someone's creative freedom is pointing at something you've suppressed, that requires a kind of honesty that is really uncomfortable. And in my experience with myself and with working with professionals, this stage is where the most people stall. And not because they lack intelligence or self-awareness. They have plenty of both. But because acknowledgement means the story you've been telling about yourself has to get more complicated. The structured journaling prompts often stop here, or just before here. They create the language of acknowledgement without the actual disorientation of it. But real acknowledgement tends to feel less like insight and more like something shifting underfoot. The third stage is integration. And integration is the most misunderstood stage. because some people assume it means eliminating the shadow equality. But it doesn't, because you don't integrate rage by getting rid of it. You integrate it by finding its appropriate expression. The honest assertion that was previously swallowed, the boundary that was never set, the refusal that needed to be spoken. Usually shadow qualities don't disappear. They transform into information about what you actually want, what you've been denying yourself permission to pursue. The suppressed ambition that has been leaking out as a resentment toward more successful colleagues becomes, when integrated, a clearer sense of what you're actually capable of and what you've been holding back. But be aware here that this is not a comfortable process, but it's an empowering one. Because the shadow material doesn't disappear. It becomes available. And the last stage, stage 4, is the stage of embodiment. And embodiment is not a destination. It's more like an ongoing orientation. It means living from a self that is larger than the persona you built in the first half of your life. It means also that the qualities you previously projected outward or suppressed entirely are now part of how you actually move through the world. The professional who spent 20 years admiring other people's courage starts making decisions from that courage themselves. The person who carried unacknowledged rage for decades starts speaking with a directness that is honest rather than explosive. But this doesn't happen like a switch, cleanly or permanently. The shadow is also not a problem you solved once. Actually, it's not at all a problem. But there is a qualitative difference between someone who is living from an integrated self and someone who is still managing the pressure of what they haven't acknowledged. And you can feel the difference in the conversation. You can feel it also in how someone makes decisions under pressure. So let me give you an example of what embodiment actually feels like, because it doesn't usually arrive as insight. I usually use for embodiment endurance events. And now if you're going on a 35-kilometer trail run, around kilometer 25, 28, when the legs are done and the mind starts negotiating, there's a voice in your head that says, "You've done enough, you can stop here. No one would know." And that voice is not weakness. It's also not the body failing. This is the shadow. Specifically the part of you that learned early that stopping was acceptable. That shrinking or getting smaller was safe. That you didn't need to find out what was on the other side of that particular wall. But if you've done the prior work, if you walk through the different stages, you can hear that voice for what it is. So you learn to not fight it anymore. You don't suppress it anymore. You just keep moving with full awareness of what's speaking. And that means embodiment. Not going against your shadow, but taking your shadow with you. Not as a permanent state. As a moment of living from a self that is larger than the one that wants to stop. Now let's have a look on how you can really perform in shadow work and not just undergoing it. So here is a simple diagnostic. If your shadow work practice has never really disoriented you, it's probably still in the performing category. And performing looks like fluency. You have the vocabulary, the self-awareness, the ability to describe your patterns with precision. But undergoing looks like discomfort that doesn't resolve cleanly. It can be a decision that costs you something because you're no longer willing to suppress what you've started to see. And the people I have watched move through this, including myself, are not the most self-aware in the room. But they are the ones willing to be wrong about themselves. It doesn't mean self-critical, just honest enough to let the story get more complicated. And that willingness is the actual work. And everything else is preparation for it. So the resentment that doesn't quite make sense. The admiration for someone else's life that has a strange edge to it. Or the career that fits perfectly on paper and feels hollow in practice. These are not problems to be managed. They are the shadows asking to be met. And most people at midlife, they spend years managing that pressure. They're getting better at describing it, and they get more sophisticated in their avoidance. Now, to be honest with you, the 4 stages of shadow work aren't a way to fix that. They're a way to stop. And they're recognition, acknowledgement, integration, embodiment. But you don't complete them. You always have to return to them. And each time with a little less to protect and a little more of yourself available. And that's what this work actually looks like when it's real. And I promise you, it's worth doing. And if you want to get really started, hop to our website and check out the Shadow Work Starter Kit. This is a small free tool that I developed to help me and you on our way of individuation. And with that, I wish you all the best, have a wonderful day, and see you next time.